Barron Trump hands out blankets to the homeless. Donald Trump's reaction melts hearts. The fireplace crackled softly in the dimly lit Trump Tower penthouse. The golden glow from the chandelier cast shadows across the high-rise windows, reflecting the New York skyline. Barron Trump sat alone on the couch, the television remote resting loosely in his fingers. The news was on. The anchor's voice was calm but distant, almost detached, as he reported on the growing crisis. Homelessness in major U.S. cities has reached record levels, with thousands left on the streets in freezing temperatures. Advocates are calling for immediate action. Barron muted the TV. His jaw tightened as the screen flashed images of makeshift tents lining the sidewalks, people huddled together for warmth beneath thin blankets. He could feel a knot forming in his stomach. He had seen reports like this before. Everyone had. But tonight, for some reason, it felt different. He grabbed his phone and searched homeless shelters near me. Most were full. His chest felt heavy. There had to be something he could do. A deep voice interrupted his thoughts. "What are you still doing up?" Barron looked up. His father, Donald Trump, stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Barron hesitated before answering. "Just watching the news." Trump glanced at the muted television, eyes flicking across the screen. A homeless encampment, a woman clutching her child in the cold. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Sad, isn't it? What the country's become." Barron studied his father's face. The casual way he said it, like it was just another unfortunate thing, another headline that would pass. Barron's fingers curled into fists. "Dad," he said carefully, "why don't we ever do anything about it?" Trump raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Barron straightened. "We help a lot of people. Charities, businesses, events. But what about them? The ones on the street?" Trump's lips pressed together. For a moment he didn't answer. Then finally he sighed. "Barron, you can't fix the world. People end up in bad situations for all kinds of reasons. Some of them refuse help. Some of them made bad choices." Barron stared at him. "There's still people." Trump exhaled through his nose. "I'm not saying they're not. I'm saying you can't save everyone." Barron's heart hammered in his chest. "I have to try." Trump frowned. Barron held his gaze. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, without another word, Barron stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the room. The next morning, Barron had a plan. He had seen enough. It wasn't going to be a grand gesture. It wasn't going to be for show. He just wanted to help. So he packed a bag. Blankets. Food. Gloves. Things that seemed so small, yet meant everything to the people who didn't have them. He zipped up his coat, adjusted his scarf, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" He turned to see Melania Trump standing at the top of the stairs, her arms crossed, a curious expression on her face. Barron hesitated. "To help," he said simply. Melania studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, she stepped aside. "Be careful," she said softly. Barron nodded. Then he stepped outside into the cold. The streets were colder than he expected. Even bundled in his warmest coat, he could feel the bite of the wind. He couldn't imagine what it must be like for the people who had to sleep out here. His breath formed small clouds in front of his face as he walked toward a line of tents under a bridge. He had seen them before, driving past, watching from the window of his father's car. But he had never stood here, never been close enough to see their faces. He swallowed, tightening his grip on the bag. Then, carefully, he approached the first person he saw. An older man, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothes, a beanie pulled low over his forehead. The man looked up, startled. Barron held out a blanket. The man hesitated. Slowly he took it. His hands were shaking. "You don't have to do this," the man murmured. Barron smiled. "I know." And then he moved to the next person. The reaction was almost always the same. Hesitation, then gratitude. Some people accepted the blankets with whispers of thanks. Others looked at him with disbelief. "You're Trump's kid?" a woman asked, pulling a thick scarf around her neck. Barron nodded. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Didn't expect kindness from your family?" Barron didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just handed her a pair of gloves. An hour passed. Barron was down to his last few blankets. As he moved through the camp, a voice caught his attention. "Take it." Barron turned. A man sat on an overturned crate, his beard scruffy, his face lined with exhaustion. His coat was tattered. His boots had holes in them. Barron handed him a blanket. The man took it, then looked up, really looking at him. "I used to be like your dad, you know?" Barron's breath hitched. The man chuckled bitterly. "Had a business. Employees. The house." He looked down at his hands. "Lost it all overnight." Barron didn't know what to say. So he just listened. "Life's funny like that," the man murmured. "One minute, you're shaking hands in a boardroom. The next, you're praying someone will give you a blanket." Barron swallowed hard. Then softly, "What happened?" The man sighed. "Bad deal. A mistake. People I trusted walked away." He shook his head. "Wasn't long before I lost my home too." Barron felt his heart clench. This man, he could have been one of his father's former employees. He could have been someone Trump once knew. Barron took a breath. Then, carefully, determinedly, he pulled out his phone. "I need to make a call," he said. And then, for the first time since he left home, he dialed his father's number. Donald Trump stood by his office window, staring down at the city below, when his phone buzzed. He saw Barron's name on the screen. Frowning, he answered. "Where are you?" Barron's voice was steady. "I need you to come see something." Trump hesitated. "Please." A long silence. Then, finally, "All right, Barron." And with that, Donald Trump stepped into his car. And the world, though it didn't know it yet, was about to witness something unforgettable. The black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the dim streetlights. The moment the door opened, the entire atmosphere shifted. People stopped talking. Some stepped back. Others stared in disbelief. Donald Trump stepped out of the car. He was wearing his signature navy suit and long overcoat, looking entirely out of place among the rows of tents and makeshift shelters. His eyes swept over the scene. People huddled under blankets, small fires flickering in barrels, children clinging to their mothers. For a brief second, something passed across his face. Barron stepped forward. "You came?" Trump turned, his expression unreadable. "I said I would." Barron studied him, trying to gauge his reaction. Trump's gaze flickered past his son, landing on the homeless man from earlier, the one who had told Barron about losing everything. The man met Trump's eyes. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a quiet kind of understanding. A long silence stretched between them. Then, the man sighed, adjusting the blanket Barron had given him. "I used to be in real estate too," he said, his voice rough from the cold. Trump's expression didn't change. "Is that so?" The man nodded. 30 years in the business. I had everything. Then one bad deal, one wrong move, and he gestured at his surroundings. Here we are." Barron could see it, the slight shift in his father's stance, the tightening of his jaw. This wasn't just some random man on the street. This was someone who had once been exactly like him. Someone who had shaken hands in boardrooms, worn expensive suits, made million-dollar deals. And now he was sitting on the pavement, clutching a blanket like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to life. For the first time since he had arrived, Donald Trump didn't have a quick answer. Barron spoke carefully. "Dad, this could have been anyone." Trump's lips pressed together. But he didn't argue. Barron stepped closer. "This is what I was trying to tell you," he continued. "It's not about bad choices. Sometimes life just takes things away." Trump exhaled through his nose, looking around again. He saw a woman in tattered clothes rocking a baby to sleep. A man in a wheelchair missing a leg. An elderly woman curled up beneath a thin jacket. For years, these people had been numbers on reports, statistics in political debates. But now they were standing right in front of him. And his own son was the one handing them blankets. Trump finally spoke. "You've been out here doing this all night?" Barron nodded. His father let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Then, before Barron could say anything else, Trump shrugged off his coat. The entire camp fell silent. Everyone watched. Even Barron froze. Trump walked over to the elderly woman, the one curled up in the cold, and draped his coat over her shoulders. The woman's eyes widened. She looked up at him, blinking in shock. Trump cleared his throat. "It's too damn cold out here." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she tugged the coat around herself, tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Trump nodded, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Barron felt his chest tighten, because for the first time, his father wasn't just looking at these people. He was seeing them. More movement, more whispers. Then, one by one, others started stepping forward. Barron dug through his bag, handing out the last of the supplies. Trump watched him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he started helping. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. But it was real. He handed out scarves. He picked up fallen blankets. He helped a man with shaking hands zip up his coat. And the entire time, Barron watched him in awe. The moment didn't last forever. Eventually, the SUV pulled back up, and Trump turned to leave. Barron felt his stomach drop. That was it. It had been just a moment. A glimpse of something human, something real. And now, it was over. But just as Trump reached for the door handle, he hesitated. Then slowly he turned back. Barron straightened. Yeah. Trump studied him, his expression softer than before. Then, for the first time in a long time, he smiled. "You did good, kid." Barron felt his throat tighten. He nodded. And for the first time, his father nodded back. The next morning, the internet exploded. Someone had filmed the entire thing. The blankets, the moment Trump gave away his coat, the silent shift in his demeanor. The footage went viral. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others called it a turning point. But for Barron? For the people on that street? It didn't matter what the world thought. Because they knew the truth. And that was enough. That night, Barron sat across from his father at the dinner table. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then, finally, Barron cleared his throat. "I don't think you're a bad person, Dad." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's reassuring." Barron smirked. "I think you've just been looking at things the wrong way." Trump exhaled. "And you think you've figured it out?" Barron shrugged. "I think I'm trying." Trump studied him. Then, in a voice softer than Barron had ever heard before, "Well, maybe I should try too." Barron's heart stilled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Trump smirked. "Don't expect me to start wearing hoodies and passing out soup, though." Barron laughed. And for the first time in a long time, so did his father. The following days were unlike anything Barron had ever experienced. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from classmates, news reporters, strangers from across the world. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had an opinion. Some called him a hero. Others called it a stunt. Barron didn't care about the headlines. What mattered was that the people he met that night had been seen. And for the first time, his father had been the one seeing them. Inside Trump Tower, Donald Trump sat at the dining table, staring at his phone. He scrolled through article after article. Donald Trump hands his coat to homeless woman. Genuine moment or PR move? Barron Trump takes action while the world watches? The Trump family's unexpected night on the streets? He exhaled sharply, setting the phone down. Across from him, Barron sat quietly, pushing his breakfast around his plate. Trump glanced at him. "You're not gonna eat?" Barron shrugged. "Not that hungry." The pause. Then Trump leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "So," he gestured toward the phone. "This is what you wanted, huh?" The whole world watching. Barron met his gaze. "I didn't do it for them." Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up his coffee, taking a slow sip. Then, casually, he said, "Well, you got me watching." Barron's heart stilled. That was the moment he knew. It wasn't about the headlines, or the cameras, or the millions of opinions flooding social media. Something had shifted in his father. And for the first time, Barron realized that was enough. That afternoon, Barron walked through the penthouse, lost in thought, when he heard his father's voice from the other room. It wasn't his usual loud, commanding tone. It was quieter, more measured. Barron slowed his steps, pausing just outside the doorway. Trump was on the phone. And he was talking about the homeless crisis. Barron's eyes widened. He had never heard his father discuss it like this before, not just as a statistic, not just as a political talking point, but as something real. Trump sighed. I don't care about the press. I want to know what we can actually do. The pause. No, I'm not talking about donations. That's not enough. Barron's chest tightened. His father, Donald Trump, the man who had dismissed his efforts just days ago, was trying to find a way to help. Later that evening, Trump sat in his office, flipping through files and reports. Barron knocked on the doorframe. Trump looked up. You need something? Barron hesitated. Then, carefully, he stepped inside. I heard you on the phone earlier. Trump leaned back in his chair. Eavesdropping now, huh? Barron smirked. Hard not to when you talk so loud. Trump let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, well, you got me thinking, kid. Barron waited. Trump tapped a finger against the desk. You really believe this isn't just a lost cause? Barron's voice was firm. Yes. Trump studied him for a long moment. Then, to Barron's shock, he nodded. All right then, Trump said. Let's do something about it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Trump's team worked behind the scenes, exploring different ways to provide immediate relief to struggling communities. For the first time, Barron wasn't just watching his father from the sidelines. He was right beside him. They visited shelters, spoke with advocates, met with organizations working to combat homelessness. And with every visit, every conversation, Barron could see it, the way his father's perspective was changing. Trump didn't become a different person overnight. He was still loud, stubborn, and set in his ways. But he was listening, really listening. And for Barron, that meant everything. One afternoon, they stood in the middle of a new housing project being developed for displaced families. Trump crossed his arms, surveying the work. This is good, he muttered. This'll help. Barron smiled. It's a start. Trump glanced at him. Then, in a voice softer than usual, you did this. Barron's breath hitched. He shook his head. We did this. Trump smirked. You got that from your mother, you know. The whole humble thing. Barron chuckled. And what did I get from you? Trump clapped a hand on his shoulder. The ability to make people listen. The months passed. The viral video became old news. But the work? The work continued. Trump launched new initiatives for housing aid. Barron kept volunteering. And though the world kept arguing over whether or not Trump's actions were genuine, Barron didn't care. Because he had seen it with his own eyes. His father had changed. Maybe not in a big, dramatic way, but in a way that mattered. And sometimes that was enough. One night, long after the media frenzy had died down, Barron and Trump sat on the balcony of their penthouse, looking out over the city. Trump sipped his drink, exhaling. So, what's next, kid? Barron thought about it. Then softly, I think I want to keep helping. Trump nodded. Good. The pause. Then Trump smirked. But if you start dressing like a hippie and making protest signs, I'm disowning you. Barron laughed. Deal. And for the first time, they weren't just father and son. They were partners in something bigger. And neither of them would ever forget it. Years passed. The world kept moving. New presidents, new policies, new stories dominating the news cycle. But one thing never changed. Barron Trump never stopped helping. The viral moment had long since faded, but his work had only grown. He didn't just stop at blankets and food drives. He started working on long-term solutions, affordable housing initiatives, mental health programs for struggling families, employment resources for those trying to rebuild their lives. He wasn't just handing out supplies anymore. He was changing lives. And the most surprising part? His father was right there with him. Donald Trump wasn't a man who admitted when he was wrong. Not publicly, not often, not easily, but privately? Privately, he had changed in a way few people ever saw. He still made headlines, still had his fiery speeches, his business ventures, his controversies. But behind closed doors, away from the cameras, he was quietly funding projects to help those he once dismissed. Shelters, community centers, employment programs. Not for attention, not for politics, but because, in his own way, he had seen what his son saw. And he couldn't unsee it. One evening, Trump sat in his office, scrolling through news articles. An event was happening downtown, a new homeless shelter opening under Barron's foundation. Trump didn't attend events like that anymore. Not because he didn't care, but because this was Barron's legacy now. Barron had grown into his own man, a leader in his own right. Trump exhaled, shaking his head as he read through the article. Barron Trump opens largest transitional housing facility in New York. Everyone deserves a second chance. Trump smirked. That kid, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He didn't need to be there. Didn't need to give a speech. Because Barron had it handled. And wasn't that the whole point? That same night, at the shelter's grand opening, Barron stood in front of a small crowd. Reporters, community members, people who had once lived on the streets but were now getting a fresh start. Barron looked out at them and took a slow breath. His speeches had gotten better over the years. More confident, more like his father. But his words were always his own. My father once told me that you can't save everyone. He started, voice steady. And maybe that's true. The pause. But I know this. You can try. The audience nodded, listening. He let his gaze sweep over the faces in the crowd. I grew up with everything. Money. Opportunity. A name that opened doors. He exhaled. But what I learned is that none of that matters if you're not using it for something bigger than yourself. More nods. A few murmurs of agreement. He continued. We all make mistakes. We all fall. Some of us have safety nets. Others don't. He gestured toward the shelter behind him. This place is for the ones who don't. A few people clapped. Barron's lips pressed together as he gathered his final words. My father built towers, he said. He built businesses. But this? He gestured at the facility. This is what I want to build. A long pause. Then applause. Genuine. Not for his last name. Not for his wealth. But for him. For what he had built. And for the first time, Barron didn't feel like Donald Trump's son. He felt like Barron Trump. Later that night, after the event was over, Barron stood outside the building, hands in his pockets, watching as people stepped through its doors for the first time. A new start. The second chance. He heard a familiar voice behind him. You did good, kid. Barron turned. His father stood a few feet away, hands tucked into his coat, watching the scene. Barron smirked. Didn't think you'd show. Trump shrugged. Didn't think I'd need to. Barron tilted his head. You proud? He asked. Trump let out a soft chuckle. I was proud a long time ago. Barron swallowed hard. His father wasn't a man of easy sentiment. He didn't say things like that lightly. And yet, he had said it. Barron nodded, glancing back at the shelter. You know, Trump continued, when I was your age, I was focused on making deals. Making money. Expanding the business. He smirked. And here you are, spending your nights in shelters? Barron chuckled. Guess I got the best of both worlds, huh? Trump nodded. A long pause. Then Trump exhaled, looking up at the stars. You ever think about running for office? Barron laughed. Oh, hell no. Trump raised an eyebrow. Language. Barron smirked. Really? From you? Trump chuckled. Fair point. Another pause. Trump's gaze softened. You know, if you ever do, you'd have my vote? Barron felt something in his chest tighten. Not with pressure, not with expectation, but with understanding. Because for the first time in his life, he knew his father wasn't pushing him toward something. He was simply proud of the man he had become. Barron smiled. Thanks, Dad. Trump clapped a hand on his shoulder. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The years moved on. The world changed. But Barron's work never stopped. And neither did the lessons his father had taught him, both the ones spoken and unspoken. It wasn't about who was watching. It wasn't about legacy or reputation. It was about doing what mattered. And in the end, that was what made all the difference. The world continued to change, but Barron Trump remained the same. His work didn't slow down. If anything, it expanded. The shelter wasn't just one building anymore. It had grown into a network, one that spanned across multiple cities, offering housing, job training, and healthcare for people trying to rebuild their lives. The name Trump was still attached to it, but this time, not as a real estate brand. This time, it was a lifeline. And that was Barron's doing. Donald Trump watched from the sidelines. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't need to be in control. This wasn't his legacy. It was his son's. And for the first time in his life, he was okay with that. One night, Barron sat in his office, looking over reports. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Barron smirked, answering. "Hey, old man." Trump scoffed. "Watch it, kid." Barron leaned back in his chair. "What's up?" Trump hesitated. Then, in a rare moment of honesty, "I was thinking about your mother today." Barron's breath hitched. Trump never talked about Melania like that. Not in casual conversations. Not in soft moments. Barron swallowed. "Yeah." Trump exhaled. "She'd be proud of you." Barron stared at his desk, his throat tight. He nodded. "Thanks, Dad." The pause. Then Trump cleared his throat. "You busy tomorrow?" Barron smiled. "For you? Always." Trump chuckled. "Good," he said. "Let's have dinner." And for the first time in years, it wasn't just an invitation. It was a promise. A promise that no matter how much the world changed, family would always come first. Years later, Barron Trump stood on the balcony of his Manhattan office, staring out over the city that had once felt so small. So many things had changed. But in the end, one thing hadn't. His father's voice still echoed in his mind. "You can't save everyone, kid." Barron exhaled, gripping the railing. Maybe his father had been right. But he had tried anyway. And that was what mattered. The Trump Foundation for Housing and Rehabilitation had grown beyond anything Barron could have imagined. What had once been a single shelter was now an international initiative. Cities across the country, and beyond, had adopted the program, using its model to provide real solutions for homelessness and poverty. Barron had spent years proving that money alone wouldn't fix the problem. People needed opportunities, dignity, a path forward. And he had built something that gave them exactly that. Not because of his last name, but because he had never stopped believing in it. The years had aged him, but they had aged his father even more. Donald Trump had slowed down. He wasn't the man who dominated headlines anymore. But he still watched everything. Even if he never admitted it, he was proud. Barron knew it every time he saw his father's expression when he walked into a shelter, shook hands with a struggling family, or unveiled another project. Trump never said the words. But he didn't have to. Because his actions had already spoken for him. One afternoon, Barron sat in his father's Florida estate, sipping coffee across from the man who had once questioned everything he believed in. Trump looked up from his newspaper, squinting. "You're too busy," he muttered. "You ever take a damn vacation?" Barron smirked. "Says the guy who worked on his campaign from a hospital bed." Trump scoffed. "That was different." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and how's that?" Trump waved a hand. "That was important." Barron chuckled, shaking his head. "You sound like me." Trump glanced at him. Then, to Barron's surprise, a small smile. "Guess I do." Time moved forward as it always did. And one day, Barron stood in the same Florida estate, but this time it was silent. Too silent. His father's chair sat empty. The newspaper untouched. The air too still. Donald Trump was gone. And for the first time, the world felt different. The memorial was massive. The biggest names in politics, business, and media attended. The cameras were everywhere. People would remember this day for decades. But for Barron, it wasn't about the spectacle. It was about the man who had shaped him, challenged him, doubted him, but always stood by him. And now it was his turn to stand by his father. The speech came naturally. He had spoken before thousands of people before. But today, his voice was different. Softer. He stepped to the podium, adjusting the microphone. Then, after a moment of silence, he spoke. "My father was a complicated man." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. Barron smirked. But one thing was always true. He never did anything halfway. Another chuckle. He let his gaze drift over the audience. "I spent years trying to prove to him that I could do something different. That I could build something he hadn't already built." The pause. "Turns out, I was wrong. A few people frowned, confused. Barron continued. Because what I built was only possible because of him. A murmur of understanding. My father didn't just build skyscrapers. He built resilience. He built confidence. He built the ability to stand up, even when people doubted you. Barron's voice tightened. And I know that because I learned it from him. He swallowed, exhaling softly. I wish I could have one more conversation with him. One more argument. One more I told you so. A small chuckle from the audience. Barron smiled. But if he were here, I think he'd be happy knowing that, in the end, I got the last word. A wave of warm laughter moved through the crowd. Barron stepped back from the podium, looked up, and for the first time he realized his father had never really left, because his lessons, his influence, his voice would always be with him, no matter where life took him next. After the service, Barron walked alone through the Florida estate, his hands in his pockets. The air was quiet, the world paused. He found himself in his father's old office. The leather chair, the golf trophies, the framed photos, and then, on the desk, a single newspaper folded neatly. The headline? Barron Trump's legacy of service expands to 20 cities. Barron felt his chest tighten. His father had read it, had kept it, had been watching all along. Barron exhaled. Then, with a small smile, he folded the paper and tucked it under his arm. And for the first time in his life, he walked away without looking back. Because he knew his father would always be right there with him, no matter what came next. Years later, the world had changed yet again. Barron Trump was no longer the young man trying to prove himself. He was a leader, a name that carried weight, but for entirely different reasons than before. The Trump name still existed in business, in politics, in real estate, but Barron had carved out his own legacy. One built on service, resilience, and change. And as he sat in his office, staring out at the New York skyline, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened, and a young boy, no older than 10, stepped inside. He had his father's blonde hair but his mother's dark eyes. Barron smiled. "Hey, champ." The boy walked over, setting his backpack on the desk. "Mom said you forgot to eat lunch again." Barron chuckled, rubbing his temple. "Your mom is too smart for me." The boy climbed into the chair across from him, swinging his legs. "She also said you promised to take me to the shelter today." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Did she?" The boy nodded seriously. "She said, and I quote, 'If your father forgets again, remind him that I have evidence of him dancing at Aunt Ivanka's wedding.'" Barron groaned. The boy grinned. "So, you coming?" Barron exhaled, closing his laptop. Yeah, let's go." The shelter was busier than usual when they arrived. Workers rushed around, unloading supplies, setting up new beds, checking in with families. Barron stepped inside with his son, watching as people moved through the halls, some familiar faces, some new. A woman in her 50s approached, smiling warmly. "Mr. Trump, you don't visit enough." Barron shook her hand. "That's because you run this place better than I ever could, Maria." Maria laughed, then turned to his son. "And you, getting taller every time I see you." The boy grinned. "I'm helping Dad today." Maria ruffled his hair. "Well, we could always use an extra set of hands." Barron watched as his son ran off to help sort supplies. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. This place, this thing he had built, wasn't just a project anymore. It was a living, breathing part of the world. Something that would exist long after he was gone. And that was all he had ever wanted. Later that evening, after dinner, Barron sat on the back patio of his home, watching the sunset. His son came outside, flopping down beside him. "You're quiet," the boy said. Barron smirked. "So are you." The boy shrugged. "I was thinking." Barron raised an eyebrow. "About what?" His son hesitated. "About Grandpa." Barron's breath hitched. He turned, studying his son carefully. "What about him?" The boy swung his legs, thinking. "I hear people talk about him all the time," he said. "Some people think he was great. Some people don't." Barron nodded slowly. "That's true. The boy frowned. So, which one is it? Barron exhaled. It was a question he had asked himself for years. A question the world had debated long after his father was gone. But for Barron, the answer had always been simple. He was both, Barron said finally. He was complicated. Stubborn. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. The boy looked up at him. But he was always my dad. The boy thought about that. Then after a long pause, you miss him? Barron's throat tightened. Every day. But he didn't say that. Instead, he smiled, wrapping an arm around his son's shoulders. I do, he said softly. The boy leaned into him, looking out at the fading sunlight. Then, so quietly Barron almost didn't hear it, I think he'd be proud of you. Barron froze. For a second, he couldn't speak. Then, finally, he let out a breath. I think so too, champ. And in that moment, with the sky turning gold and the world quiet around them, he felt something settle deep inside him. Not closure, not finality, but peace. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't living in his father's shadow. He was living in his father's light. And that was enough. Years continued to pass, and Barron Trump's life settled into something steady, purposeful, and fulfilling. He had spent decades building his own legacy, one that stood separate from his father's but was, in many ways, deeply connected to it. Now, as an older man, he sat in his office, looking through old photographs. Some of them were of his father, smiling, laughing, caught in candid moments the world never got to see. Some were of his mother, graceful, elegant, always watching over him with quiet strength. And some were of himself, as a boy, as a young man, as a father. Each one told a story. Each one reminded him of how far he had come. A gentle knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in. The door opened and his son, now a young man in his 20s, stepped inside, holding a stack of papers. Barron smirked. You always bring me paperwork. You're worse than my assistants. His son rolled his eyes. It's important. Barron sighed, setting the photographs down. All right, what is it? His son placed the stack in front of him. It's the proposal for the international expansion. They want your approval before moving forward. Barron flipped through the pages. The foundation had grown beyond his wildest dreams. Shelters had become entire communities. Job programs had become full-scale career pipelines. And now, there were talks of expanding beyond the US, taking what they had built and bringing it to the world. Barron leaned back in his chair. You ready for this? He asked, glancing at his son. His son smirked. Are you? Barron chuckled. He saw it now, the same fire in his son's eyes that had once burned in his own. The same determination. The same drive to build something that would last beyond a lifetime. Barron nodded, picking up a pen. All right, he said. Let's take it global. He signed his name, setting the papers aside. His son grinned. You won't regret this. Barron smirked. I know. That evening, as Barron sat on his balcony, watching the city below, he thought about his father again. He wondered what he would say if he could see everything now. Would he be surprised? Would he be proud? Or would he simply smirk, cross his arms, and say, Told you that name would take you places, kid? Barron chuckled to himself, shaking his head. One thing was certain, his father's voice would never really leave him. And honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. The sun had barely begun to rise over New York City, casting a golden hue over the skyline. The world was still waking up, but Barron Trump was already seated at his desk, pen in hand, signing off on another project that would push his foundation's efforts even further. Across from him, his son sat, tapping his fingers impatiently against the polished wood. You take forever to read things, he muttered. Barron smirked, flipping to the last page. You take forever to understand patience? His son rolled his eyes but smiled. It was a conversation they had often, one that always ended the same way. Barron signing the document. His son smiling with that same determined fire in his eyes. And the world around them continuing to change. As they left the office, a group of journalists waited outside the building. The Trump name was still a magnet for media attention, but the questions had changed over the years. No longer were they about controversy or politics. Now they were about impact. Mr. Trump, can we get a comment on the new project? Barron, how does it feel knowing your foundation has reached 50 countries? What's next for the Trump legacy? Barron stopped, his son beside him, and turned toward the reporters. He had learned to embrace the cameras over the years, not as a means of vanity, but as a tool. A way to amplify the message. To answer your question, Barron said smoothly, this isn't about legacy. It never was. The reporters leaned in eager. Barron glanced at his son before continuing. This is about people. It's about making sure that the next person who loses their home, their job, their family, has somewhere to turn. A murmur ran through the crowd. His son grinned, watching his father work the press like a seasoned pro. One reporter raised a hand. And what would your father say if he could see all of this? Barron hesitated. Then, with a soft smile, he answered. I think he'd say, took you long enough, kids. Laughter rippled through the group. Barron turned to his son, clapped a hand on his shoulder, and led him toward their car. They had more work to do. Later that night, Barron sat in his study, staring at an old letter. It was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded. It was one of the few personal notes his father had ever written to him. Carefully, he unfolded it. But if you ever feel like you're lost, remember this. Winners build. Losers destroy. Doesn't matter what it is. A business, a family, a life. Make sure whatever you do, you build. The Barron exhaled. He had spent his whole life building. Not towers. Not hotels. Not casinos. But something real. Something that would last. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Then, with a small smile, he turned off the light and let the world rest. Tomorrow, there would be more to build. And he was ready. The years continued to pass, but Barron Trump's mission never wavered. His foundation had become one of the most influential humanitarian efforts in the world. Millions of people had been helped, given homes, jobs, a second chance at life. But despite all his accomplishments, Barron had never forgotten where it started. And today he was going back. Back to the place where it all began. The car ride was quiet. His son sat beside him, watching as the city passed by. You're really doing this? His son asked, curiosity laced in his voice. Barron smiled softly. It's time. The driver pulled up to a familiar street. Barron recognized it instantly. It was the same spot where, decades ago, he had handed out blankets to the homeless. The same place where his father had first opened his eyes to the struggles of others. Barron stepped out of the car, taking a slow breath. The streets had changed. Gentrification had pushed many of the camps elsewhere, but a few remained. People still sat huddled under awnings, still fought for survival. The work was never over. His son walked beside him, looking around. This is where you started? Barron nodded. Yeah, right here. His son studied him. And Grandpa? This is where he... Barron smirked. This is where he handed a woman his coat. His son chuckled. That doesn't sound like him. Barron laughed. Oh, it doesn't. The pause. But sometimes people surprise you. A man sitting on the sidewalk looked up, squinting. Ooh, you're him, aren't you? Barron turned. The man's face was lined with age, but there was a spark of recognition in his eyes. You're the kid who used to bring us blankets? Barron smiled. That's me. The man chuckled, shaking his head. I'll be damned. You really kept going, didn't you? Barron nodded. Yeah, he said softly. I did. The man gestured at his son. Teaching the next generation too, huh? Barron glanced at his son, pride swelling in his chest. That's the idea. For the next few hours, Barron and his son walked the streets, talking to people, handing out food, listening to their stories. His son took it all in, just as Barron had all those years ago. The cycle continued. A new generation learning, caring, building. By the time they returned to the car, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city. His son was quiet, deep in thought. Then finally, I get it now, he murmured. Barron turned to him. Get what? His son exhaled, looking out the window. Why you never stopped? Barron smiled. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't have to, because some things don't need to be explained. Some things are just understood. That night, Barron sat in his home office, watching the city lights flicker outside. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Barron frowned, unlocking his screen. The message was simple. Your father would be proud. Barron's breath caught. No name. No sender information. Just those words. He exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. Then, with a small smile, he looked up at the framed photo of his father on the wall. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed it.